On March 6, 1998, William Clayton Jr., a devoted father of 7 who had just finished his workday and had stopped to get cash for a date with his wife, and was slain in cold blood by a repeat murderer. Clayton was preparing to take his wife of 38 years out to dinner. The courier van driver stopped to withdraw money from an ATM at Regions Bank in Center, about 85 miles northeast of Birmingham. William Clayton Jr. was retired from a job at a railroad company and was a Korean War veteran. The father of 7 was still working to help provide for his family. Around the same time, Edmund Gavin had driven to the region from Chicago with his cousin, Dwayne Meeks, arriving in downtown Center just as Clayton went to the ATM. While the men were stopped at an intersection near Regions Bank, Meeks testified that Edmund Gavin got out of the car, walked up to the driver's side of Clayton's van and fired 2 shots. Meeks, saying he was scared, then drove off in his car, while Edmund Gavin got in Clayton's van with Clayton still in it and bleeding out and followed Meeks. A police pursuit of the van ensued but ended with Gavin's capture in the woods, where police later discovered the murder weapon, a .40 caliber Glock pistol. An officer who heard about the shooting on his radio found Clayton barely alive in the van, and he was pronounced dead shortly after at a hospital. Meeks was arrested weeks later in Chicago on a murder charge in the case, but prosecutors later dropped it. Gavin's conviction was in part due to Meeks' testimony. Edmund Gavin, who had previously been convicted of murder in 1982, detailed in several appeals for a new murder trial that Meeks was the one who shot Clayton and not him. Meeks has never been convicted in the crime, and 2 other witnesses positively identified Gavin as the shooter. Edmund Gavin grew up in a gang-infested housing project in Chicago, living in overcrowded houses that were in poor condition, where he was surrounded by drug activity, crime, violence, and riots. Gavin had previously been convicted of murder, serving 17 years of a 34-year sentence, before being released on parole, and attempted murder for shooting at a law enforcement officer. A jury convicted Edmund Gavin of capital murder and voted 10-2 to recommend a death sentence, which a judge imposed. Most states now require a jury to be in unanimous agreement to impose a death sentence. A federal judge ruled in 2020 that Edmund Gavin had ineffective counsel at his sentencing hearing because his original lawyers failed to present more mitigating evidence of Gavin's violent and abusive childhood in Chicago. After receiving a death sentence, Mr. Gavin appealed time after time for years to avoid justice, but failed at every attempt. Today, that justice was finally delivered for Mr. Clayton's loved ones, Alabama Gov. Kiv said in his statement. I offer my prayers for Mr. Clayton's family and friends, who still mourn his loss all these years later. A federal appeals court overturned the decision, which allowed the death sentence to stand. Gavin had been largely handling his own appeals in the days ahead of his scheduled execution. He filed a handwritten request for a stay of execution, asking that the lethal injection be stopped for the sake of life and limb. A circuit judge and the Alabama Supreme Court rejected that request. Edmund Gavin had maintained his innocence since 1998, pointing the finger at a cousin who was at the crime scene with him. An execution date was set for Edmund Gavin July 18, 2024. Shortly before his execution, Gavin filed a handwritten motion with the U.S. Supreme Court requesting a stay in the execution based on a claim that he was denied due process because he was indigent and couldn't pay a filing fee. The claim Gavin was referring to is from July 10, 2024. In this case, justice should not be denied because filing fees wasn't paid when it should have been waived because of petitioner's indigent status. Gavin wrote in his plea to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court denied Gavin's request for a stay of execution and agreed with a lower court that determined he had enough funds in his prison account to pay for filing fees. Death penalty opponents delivered a petition Wednesday the 17th of July 2024 to Governor Kiv asking her to grant clemency to Keith Edmund Gavin. They argued that there are questions about the fairness of Gavin's trial and that Alabama is going against the downward trend of executions in most states. On July 18, 2024, the execution began shortly after the U.S. Supreme Court turned down Gavin's request for a stay of execution, which he had filed himself in a handwritten document. "I love my family," Gavin said in his final statement at about 6:10 p.m., which appeared to be followed by a few words that were not audible. Gavin, who is Muslim, appeared to move his lips in prayer as his spiritual advisor stood beside the gurney. He had a finger lifted on both hands in what appeared to be the Islamic gesture meaning Allah is the only God. As a sedative began flowing through the IV line, his head, which had been lifted, fell back on the gurney, and Gavin appeared to lose consciousness. At about 6:20, a corrections officer performed a consciousness check saying his name, brushing his eyelids and pinching his arms, which is done before the final two drugs are administered. Soon afterward, his breathing faded. Lethal injection has been the method used for most executions in the modern era, according to the Death Penalty Information Center, a non-profit that provides data and analysis on capital punishment. States and jurisdictions can use a 1, 2 or 3 drug combination. The 3-drug combination involves an anesthetic or sedative, then a drug to paralyze the prisoner and a drug to stop the heart. Problems have arisen with lethal injections in the form of botched executions. Officials have struggled to find veins, intravenous lines have clogged with the deadly chemicals, and prisoners have had violent reactions to the dispensed drugs. Additionally, there have been shortages of the drugs used for lethal injection. Alabama recently authorized the use of nitrogen gas for executions. In January, Kenneth Eugene Smith became the first inmate to be executed with this new method. Another inmate in Alabama is set to be executed by nitrogen gas in September 2024. The day before Gavin's execution, he refused breakfast, lunch and dinner but ate a bag of Ruffles cheddar sour cream potato chips, a bag of Lay's plain potato chips and a chocolate Hershey bar with almonds, according to the Alabama Department of Corrections. Gavin refused his final meal Thursday the 18th of July 2024, and did not make any special requests, the Corrections Department said. He did eat some ice cream and drank Mountain Dew as a snack. Alabama agreed last week in Gavin's case to forego a post-execution autopsy, which is typically performed on executed people who are incarcerated in the state. Gavin said the procedure would violate his religious beliefs. He had filed a lawsuit seeking to stop plans for an autopsy, and the state settled the complaint. In a lawsuit filed earlier this year, Gavin asked state officials not to conduct an autopsy on his body after the execution due to his religious beliefs, which the Alabama Department of Corrections agreed to. Mr. Gavin is a devout Muslim, the lawsuit read, according to AL.com. His religion teaches that the human body is a sacred temple, which must be kept whole. As a result, Mr. Gavin sincerely believes that an autopsy would desecrate his body and violate the sanctity of keeping his human body intact. Based on his faith, Mr. Gavin is fiercely opposed to an autopsy being performed on his body after his execution. Gavin's execution was the 10th in the U.S. this year and the 3rd in Alabama. Texas, Georgia, Oklahoma and Missouri also have conducted executions this year. The Supreme Court on Tuesday the 16th of July 2024 blocked the state of Texas from executing an inmate 20 minutes before he was scheduled to receive a lethal injection. Thank you for watching Death Row.